Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Chris Letheby. Chris is a philosopher of mind and cognitive science who works on issues arising from the use of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry and neuroscience. His doctoral research, conducted at the University of Adelaide, presented the first systematic analysis of the psychedelic experience within the framework of 21st century philosophy of cognitive science. He is currently lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Adelaide. He's the author of a wonderful new book entitled Philosophy of Psychedelics. Today we talk about how to reconcile psychedelic experiences with naturalism. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Chris Letheby. Chris, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, James.
You're very welcome. So maybe we can begin with how you came to specialize in the philosophy of psychedelics.
Sure, yeah. So I was pursuing my graduate training in philosophy and I was working in philosophy of cognitive science. So I'd done my master's, my MPhil thesis on a topic to do with language comprehension and embodied cognition in cognitive science. And I was going to do my PhD on a topic to do with mental representation, but around that time I became aware, this was sort of 2013, so 9 years ago now, I became aware of the history of psychedelics and some of their effects, and the fact that, nobody in academic philosophy had really had much to say about it. I mean, by this point, the sort of modern era of psychedelic research was 20 years in. It hadn't achieved anything like the level of visibility that it has in the subsequent years, but still there were trials underway, more trials in the works. And by that point, there was a long tradition in philosophy. I mean, this has been especially common since the early 90s of taking abnormal or unusual cognitive states as a source of evidence in the philosophy of mind. So there's been this whole interdisciplinary program of philosophical psychopathology, the idea that we can learn something about the structure and function and properties of the ordinary mind by studying the abnormal mind in one way or another. And the fact that, philosophers of mind in this area had plundered virtually every kind of conscious or cognitive condition you can think of for kind of insights into the mind and how it works, and yet hadn't really touched psychedelic states as far as I could see, was just amazing. I just thought there's got to be something to say here. And so I started becoming interested in moving my PhD in that direction. And shortly after that, it sort of moved from just there's got to be something to learn here about the mind to, focusing more on the spiritual aspects of psychedelic experience and the idea that, the epistemic properties of these experiences, their ability to impart knowledge of some kind, needed more attention, needed investigation. Especially, I'm kind of probably foreshadowing a lot of the conversation here, but especially in the context of a materialist or naturalist worldview, which I embrace. So,
right. And with that taboo around, I mean, I'm assuming there's a kind of taboo around looking at psychedelics. You were saying that this was neglected, and I've definitely heard within science there was a time where it was seen as a kind of career ender if you turned your attention to psychedelics. Do you think that kind of, because they had such a huge cultural impact, many decades ago, do you think that might be why there was perhaps a taboo around them?
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be something to do with it. That has to play a role. Also, probably by that point, just not that many people knew about the research. It's been remarked on, we had sort of a couple of decades of total ignorance about psychedelics and their effects in most relevant disciplines, and that would include philosophy. It's also worth mentioning that, they weren't completely untouched, and Thomas Metzinger in particular is one person who was looking at psychedelic states and who had built psychedelic states into the evidence base for his neurophilosophical work, his work in the philosophy of mind, in the mid to late 90s and even before that. So he was one philosopher who was sort of engaged in that, and I wasn't clearly aware of that at the time. But yeah, probably a combination of taboo, stigma, ignorance, these kinds of things.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned you were kind of foreshadowing the perspective you're coming from here, which I think we share, which is a kind of a desire to understand the value of psychedelic insights within a naturalistic framework, which I think we both think can be done. And so maybe if we spend a bit of time talking about what we both feel naturalism to be, because it's a hard thing to pin down, right?
Yeah, sure. Yes, exactly. And so people typically make this distinction between methodological and metaphysical naturalism, or ontological philosophical naturalism. And so I embrace a version of both of those. And methodological naturalism is just the idea that philosophy ought to be continuous with the sciences in some sense. There's no kind of distinctive philosophical method that can give you access to sort of depths of truth that are inaccessible to science, that philosophy and science together are just part of this integrated endeavor to learn about the world and what it's like. So I subscribe to that. And then metaphysical naturalism, which of course tends to be the most relevant one in this sort of conversation. Obviously the slogan version is the natural world is all there is, and there are all kinds of obvious problems with that. It depends what you mean by natural. But really, when I say that I subscribe to metaphysical naturalism, I'm just talking about like a generic materialism or physicalism of some kind, basically thinking that everything, including the mind, including consciousness, mental phenomena, is wholly physical. Now, notoriously, to make sense of that, you have to say what it is for something to be physical, and there are further problems that arise. So with my back against the wall, what I really mean by it is that minds emerge from the non-minded, basically that there is no mind at the foundation of reality. And so conscious experience, intelligence, meaning, representation, all of these things are somehow built out of complex combinations of fundamental particles, forces, processes, whatever they turn out to be, that are non-minded, that are non-meaningful, that are non-conscious. So these things, the mind and meaning and consciousness are latecomers. They are things that develop or evolve out of a non-minded substrate. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that perspective, and I think you're right here on those 2 points. And the maybe the least precise thing we might be able to say that would resonate with people is the idea that the supernatural doesn't exist. And to me, the supernatural, something supernatural when there's a discontinuity with our explanations of the natural world and then this other phenomenon, right? So if there's spirits that don't obey the laws of physics, you have the natural world that can be studied through science and philosophy, and then there's this other stuff there's a fundamental discontinuity. And so I think, there's this kind of intuition I have that everything, at least when we build maps of the world through science and philosophy, we should aspire to have it all hang together. We shouldn't just say this thing exists for its own sake. There is no way it relates to everything else. And then the other point was the taking a kind of physicalist or materialist perspective and defining that as consciousness being emergent, which I like, because if you say, the world is made of matter, I immediately have this question of, well, what is matter? I'm quite suspicious of statements of absolute substances. So if we take this kind of combined package of there are no supernatural phenomena and consciousness emerges. I mean, I think this is in your work, you're really exploring, right, the place of consciousness. Is there a kind of universal consciousness at the beginning of it all, or is it an emergent phenomenon? And so is your instinct that a lot of people come out of psychedelic experiences with an intuition around some kind of cosmic consciousness that exists before matter, and that there's some tension here with naturalism as a result?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that seems to happen, although how common it is exactly is sort of an ongoing empirical research project, right? So you have Benny Shannon, for instance, in his book on ayahuasca, which is based both on his own experiences, a couple of hundred experiences of his own, and on interviews with a couple of hundred other ayahuasca drinkers. He says that, something like Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy is the metaphysic that comes out of the ayahuasca experience. People come out saying that everything is grounded in a cosmic consciousness, and it's this kind of, somewhat pantheistic idealism, idealistic monism. But it's an interesting question whether that stacks up empirically. So I've been involved in this project recently with led by Chris Timmerman from Imperial College to construct a questionnaire and have a look at the effects of psychedelics on people's metaphysical beliefs. And the big take-home story is, yes, they do seem to move people away from naturalism, but it's not yet clear whether, and granted in this study, we looked at more than just ayahuasca, so Shannon might still be right that there's a trend there, but it's not clear yet that they specifically move people towards a cosmic consciousness type view. I mean, I think you can read a lot of accounts where that is what seems to be coming out, but it seems like they can also move people towards some kind of panpsychism, substance dualism, some belief in a spirit world or supernatural realm. So, I mean, the slogan version, and again, it's getting a bit more imprecise in order to get at the right level of abstraction to capture the right generalization. So there's this line from Houston Smith, who was very much not a naturalist, that I like quoting, where he says the central message of the entheogens, another name for psychedelics, is that there is another reality, capital R, that puts this one in the shade. And I think that's a really nice way of defining the negation of naturalism. It's not precise. It leaves a lot of the technical details to be worked out, but metaphysical naturalism is pretty much the view that there is no other reality that puts this one in the shade. And what seems to be coming out of these current empirical studies, and there are other studies as well about psychedelics, leading people to stop being atheists and so on. And the general signal, I think, amidst all the noise is that, psychedelic experiences very often do lead people to adopt or to more strongly hold non-naturalistic beliefs of some kind, beliefs that, there is a cosmic consciousness, a ground of being, or perhaps some kind of spirit world, supernatural realm, non-physical realm, or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I think there's, when we're talking about ayahuasca in particular, it's worth differentiating between two kind of prototypical kinds of psychedelic experience. You have these kind of unitive mystical experiences, then the more kind of relational, interactive ones. I think Rick Strassman used similar terms to kind of differentiate this in his DMT work. And it seems to me, I think everyone I've ever spoken to, including myself, who's done ayahuasca, comes away with this feeling of, wow, like I feel like I saw some kind of spirit world that really doesn't fit with science. And then, someone like myself, I take the kind of Benny Shannon route of just kind of thinking, like that was weird. And then also having my commitment to naturalism and I think in his work, it's interesting to read, right? Because he doesn't say like, oh, it's a trivial, it's clearly a trivial trick of the mind. It's easy to explain away, but there's a bit of a tension there. But then in the work, your written work that I've read, it seems you're largely talking about these kind of unitive mystical experiences that people have, maybe with psilocybin in clinical studies. And for me, those experiences, it might be because my first one of them happened at a young age before psychedelics, but to me, there's I guess it wasn't a cosmic consciousness experience, and I feel as a result, it's very possible to have unitive mystical experiences with no metaphysical content. I mean, I guess I wouldn't say there was no metaphysical content, but it was, I guess it was along to me, these states are states of reducing how much you conceptualize. And so you can have insight through realizing, not through gaining kind of some new extra knowledge, but realizing you were engaged in a delusion. So I'm sure this is something we'll get to later around the kind of nature of the self. But I think, we see the world through concepts and we think it's made of these rigid objects. And then you can see in these kinds of experiences that actually that's a mental construct. So there is a kind of, for me, it felt like there was a metaphysical insight in terms of the unity of existence, and also that it's more process-like rather than being made of rigid objects that exist over time. So I feel like I did get metaphysical insight into unity and impermanence, both of which to me are thoroughly naturalistic phenomena.
Yeah.
And there was no kind of cosmic consciousness part. So do you think it's not necessary that when someone has a mystical unitive experience that they come away with a kind of consciousness only or consciousness is fundamental insight?
It certainly doesn't happen universally. I mean, yeah, you're living proof of that, and there are other cases as well. I mean, it's one of the long-running questions, of course, in the study of mystical experiences: how much is, in the experience, and how much is in the subsequent interpretation of it? And of course, you get the sort of strong constructivist sort of Stephen Katz position that it's the experience is through and through permeated by culture and concepts and interpretation. I don't buy that, but it's not clear where the line is. So when you have people who have the cosmic consciousness type experience, or well, I mean, I'm begging the question in the way I'm describing it. When you have people who have what is clearly a unitive mystical experience, and they come away believing in a cosmic consciousness, have they had a cosmic consciousness type experience, or have they just had a unitive experience that they've subsequently interpreted in cosmic consciousness type terms? Obviously, it's very hard to tell. But yeah, I would agree that certainly not everyone who has a unitive experience comes away with that belief, and clearly some people do.
Yeah. I'm sympathetic to that speculation that So I guess for me, an appreciation of how relentlessly we conceptualize and how we get kind of lost in our concepts, and we don't realize that we're seeing through concepts, and we take them as kind of solid reality instead of noticing that. I guess for me, if you approach all of this with I guess a kind of meditative perspective and understanding that that's what your mind does, it kind of always worms its way in with stories. If you come to these experiences with that framework, as you enter the kind of unitive mystical state, you can understand it as a kind of perspective shift where you're not seeing a transcendent reality or anything like that. You're still in the same reality, but you're letting go of all your relative conceptualizing, and you're just kind of laid bare. And that's partly why it's ineffable, because you can't really you've had all your word making machinery kind of dismantled, so you can't really put into words. You're just in this state of bare being, and then a moment later, as soon as you have the ability to start making a narrative, I think your mind does. And so it could, almost in the midst of the experience, as soon as you can conceptualize, you might say something like, oh, I'm seeing the universal consciousness, or something like that. So my instinct is that that's kind of what's happening, just speculating here. And the experiences themselves are, I'm more inclined to think of them as ineffable experiences of being in a non-conceptual state, rather than a direct experience of a universal consciousness. But it requires people to really get to unpick this. Would require people to become kind of trained in contemplative skills, I guess, to really see in their own mind what's going on moment to moment in these experiences.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's also possible, of course, that both are happening, that in some cases you have an experience that is totally non-conceptual, unstructured, and then as soon as the narrative machinery kicks back in, it gets interpreted as an experience of universal consciousness, if someone is familiar with those ideas or has come across them. And perhaps in other cases, because I think that there are reasons, this is something I try and bring out in the book. I think there are, if you adopt certain plausible naturalistic ideas about the architecture of the mind, how the mind works, there are reasons to think that if you mess with it in the right way, you should in fact get cosmic consciousness type experiences. You should get experiences as of boundless mind, or something like that. So yeah, I'm kind of heavily inclined to think that there might be experiences that somehow non-verbally have that as part of their content, you know what I mean, that actually phenomenally simulate a world specifically of boundless consciousness. So it might be that in some cases that's what's happening, but maybe not.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about what, in a naturalistic framework where mind is emergent, why you would have an experience of this, I guess, of consciousness seeming fundamental. And I take the stance that consciousness is very much bound up with biological survival processes. But it just so turns out that all the kind of suffering that goes along with being a living system that you use to navigate the world, that's not the most fundamental level of experience. The awakeness, the conscious part of consciousness, that's just the lights being on, well, many people have attested it can exist without all the dynamics of suffering and pain. Now, I don't think it necessarily had to be that way, but I think we're just lucky that it turns out that that's the case, and that therefore, if you let go, you can release into a perspective of just being where the lights are on, and it's a state of kind of liberation. And I think so. Yeah, I think for me, these two perspectives of being in relative conceptualizing versus just being. It just so happens that there's, I guess this is kind of a bit more aligns with kind of Buddhist psychology, where you're. I think that's interesting that people who take psychedelics, or if you look in the 60s, a lot of people became interested in kind of Vedantic Hindu metaphysics and this kind of consciousness only worldview, and other people went a more psychological route with kind of Western interpretations of Buddhism, and I guess I'm coming from that kind of latter secular kind of psychological camp. But I think it's sorry.
Actually, sorry if I can interrupt, you're the first other person I've heard put it quite like that, but this has sort of been a line I've taken in conversation with a few people that, that crudely there are two takes you can have on the psychedelic mystical experience. There's the Buddhist take and the Hindu take. There's kind of the metaphysically light, it's all about negative insights and things like this. And then there's the metaphysically heavy. It's about discovering the real cosmic consciousness, ground of being, whatever. And I go very heavily for the sort of secular naturalistic Buddhist type approach.
Right. Yeah, and I've used this phrase gnosis through negation, because to me that kind of captures this idea you can have gnosis, knowledge, insight, but only through dismantling. And to me that's a thoroughly naturalistic approach, because as I mentioned earlier, you're dismantling your own kind of conceptual machinery. It's all within the stuff that you have domain over. There's no kind of transmission of stuff from outside of you.
Here's I was going to say, here's an interesting thought, and I hope everyone who's watching this is pretty familiar with this terrain, because we're not doing a lot of preamble. I mean, we're diving into some fairly deep waters fairly quickly, but I wonder what you think about the idea that even in cases of gnosis by negation, there's still a very real and substantial risk of kind of non-gnosis, of agnosis, of fake gnosis, or something like this. So, I mean, are you familiar with Thomas Metzinger's model of MPE, minimal phenomenal experience?
Right, yeah.
So this idea that, is very close to what you were saying, the idea that pure consciousness or pure awareness that is experienced in meditative states is very close to being the feeling of the lights being on. It's this basic predictive model of intrinsic arousal of the brain, the cortex being awake, essentially. But people have said all kinds of things about that experience. And if Metzinger's hypothesis is true, it's like it doesn't wear it on its sleeve, you know what I mean? If that experience of pure consciousness is an experience of a predictive model of the driving signal from the ascending reticular activating system, we have no access to that when we experience it. And I was thinking a similar thought earlier. Sorry, I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but these are really interesting topics. I was thinking a similar thought earlier when you were talking about metaphysical insight, because there's a worry, right, that let's say our minds, our brains are these substantialist machines that go around kind of reifying things and saying, here's a solid object called I, called table, called chair, whatever. And then we kind of dissolve that machinery somehow, and we experience a world that is all flow, that is all process and relation and things like this. I guess there's a worry that even if that's true, even if it's true that the world is like that, that the true metaphysics is like process based or relations based rather than substance based, it's still kind of only an accident. You know, all we're learning about directly is really our minds and the way they reify things. It could still be the case for all that, you know, there really is a world of fixed, solid, persistent substances out there. It's like the conclusion that there isn't comes by sort of independent arguments. It's not guaranteed by the experience. I wonder what you think about all that.
Yeah, that's a great point. The as to whether we can be misled, and I guess yeah. So whenever I mention this idea that you might get insight into something like impermanence, I'm usually careful to say that it's there's no guarantee that it's actually correct, which I think is what you're pointing to, right? But it feels like a reasonable conclusion to come to if you don't hold on to it very tightly and you don't say like it has to be this way. But if you say, okay, well, I used to think that I was a solid thing that would exist over time. I had some essence that would you know, that might incline me to think, well, maybe there's a soul that exists after death or anything like that. And I used to think that things around me were kind of fixed objects, and now actually I see that that belief isn't what I thought it was, and actually everything seems to be far more in flux as far as I can tell when I introspect and I, you know, look at the world around me. If it does turn out that there are eternal objects floating around that, you know, don't impact my life, or yeah, it's not really of consequence. So I guess I'm coming to kind of a pragmatic conclusion. I guess this brings it back to the kind of Buddhist perspective, which I feel is actually on the kind of firmest ground, where if you're interested in well-being and kind of liberation from suffering, that's, you can really talk about that. You can really talk about your own sense of suffering. If you're talking about metaphysical conclusions, I guess I always feel very disinclined to make any strong statements about metaphysics. It seems to me something that is really, by definition, across the border of what we can really know. I guess it's a kind of Kantian, like, you know, the noumenon really is luminous and unknowable. So we can get some hints about what's going on, but I completely agree that there's no guarantee of really getting direct access to it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think we're in agreement about a lot of this. I mean, the reason I press this point is because, you know, I mean, in my book, I talk a lot about this idea of phenomenal opacity, like seeing your mental representations of the world as representations. And I guess that's what I think is sort of the real insight you get here. I think, you know, you might get metaphysical insights that happen to be true. You know, they happen by a happy chance to line up with the true metaphysics, but pretty clearly you can get, under psychedelics and in altered states, you can get phenomenal simulations of all kinds of different metaphysical pictures. So it's sort of like, seems almost coincidental if sometimes you happen to get the right one. But where I think you're kind of directly plugged into the truth of what you're coming to know is when you know, it's exactly what you were describing before, kind of seeing that we normally see the world filtered through all these conceptual structures and don't realize that we're doing it, you know, realizing that what we ordinarily reflexively take for an actual, you know, objective mind independent world of solid fixed objects is in fact a story, you know, some kind of model that the brain is creating. That's, for my money, where the kind of the one of the core insights where you're really getting directly in touch with the topic of the insight, you know.
Right. Yeah, and also to pick up on the idea that you know, when you have these kinds of bare awareness experiences, if it's some biological process going on, but it feels like cosmic consciousness, there seems to be some disconnect there, right? With you think you're having an insight into something profound metaphysically, but actually it's just some kind of biological quirk. And I guess that's kind of my stance when it comes to these metaphysical insights around cosmic consciousness. I feel like if you imagine for living systems that we have, as I mentioned before, you know, the awareness component is more fundamental than the content of, suffering and pain. And then if you can just unwind all the conceptualizing through meditation, through psychedelics, and then you're left in this kind of this bare awareness state, then as a living system who's kind of confined to your own mind, it feels like you've hit bedrock. From your perspective, it feels like this is it. I'm at the most grounded, fundamental, deepest level, whatever word you want to use. But to me, that seems like, well, it's because the horizon for you as a living system, kind of like the Big Bang for living systems really was kind of the origin of life or the origin of consciousness. And so that feels like the most fundamental thing from our perspective. So I think this is where we get into this situation where people feel like, well, no, consciousness feels so fundamental. It must have been there at the actual kind of physical Big Bang. And I think that's an error to think that it applies to the physical world just because it applies to you from your perspective as a living system.
Right. So we're very much on the same page here, or at least in the same chapter. And, so I talk a lot in the book about this idea of consciousness as a controlled hallucination, in the phrase that, Anil Seth has popularized. And I think that the idea of conscious experience as being this intracranial, internal sort of virtual model of the world that the organism is creating. I mean, it really is a Kantian idea, or it's, similar to sort of good old-fashioned indirect realism or something like that. But I think that is key to understanding a lot of the apparent insights that come up again and again in the psychedelic experience and in other altered states that, for my money, and it sounds like for yours too, are real insights that get misinterpreted. And so this one of consciousness being fundamental or being basic or being everywhere, it's like, that is, if this controlled hallucination view of consciousness is correct, that is true in terms of the world you live in, your experiential world, because your experiential world just is your brain's conscious simulation of the world. And in that experiential world, consciousness is everywhere. It is all pervasive. It is fundamental. And so you have that insight. And so, I say it's kind of a combination. If you're using these philosophical concepts of phenomenal opacity and transparency, transparency, not recognizing your mental representations as representations, opacity, recognizing them as representations. It's like you have a certain measure of opacity because you recognize that all of this is mind, all of this is consciousness, but you've got a retained bit of transparency in that you think this is the actual world, this is the world outside of my head, outside of my body, rather than recognizing, oh yeah, this is the experiential world inside my head. And of course it's all consciousness, as people do in lucid dreams and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it's good to pause on that terminology of transparency and opacity, because I think it's very useful, right? And so, as you're saying, like in everyday life, consciousness tends to be transparent in that if we think of it as a simulation that the organism's running to navigate the world, I never see this glass directly. There's some quantum, stuff going on out there, we think, but what I'm really seeing is a representation. But I don't feel that way. I don't feel like it's representation. I feel like it's a glass that exists out there, and as a result of that transparency of the representation being transparent, I can reach out, I can grab it, I can drink it, I can navigate through the world. Now, if I take a high dose of a psychedelic and it starts melting and all the colors start mixing with everything else, suddenly I'm seeing, oh, wait a minute, that was never a rigid object that I was seeing directly through the kind of clear windows of my eyes. It was a simulation, right? And so suddenly now you're seeing you're seeing consciousness for what it is, and it's becoming opaque, and you can look at it. And then, so as there are two other kind of aspects of when you lose we should get into talking about the idea of ego dissolution, because I think when you lose the concepts that apply to the self, there are two other I think insights one can have that can be understood naturalistically that often, or almost always, I think are thought of as non-natural, which is the sense of there being one consciousness. I'm again understood as a perspective shift. I'm sympathetic to, in the sense that if you have a bunch of cells that divided, and each one became obsessed with their differences through some psychological process, but then you get rid of that psychological process, then there's the kind of obvious appreciation that they're two examples of the same phenomenon. There's a commonality to them. And so you could say that all fire is fire. And so like all consciousness is consciousness. So it's a perspective shift where you feel a kinship with all other conscious things. And you think, well, even though we're physically in different kind of bubbles, there's this one thing of consciousness happening. So we usually don't feel that way because we're engaged in this kind of self-preservation psychology of, well, James is the center of the universe from my perspective. And so and it's very much tied up with my personality. But if you get rid of all the personality stuff, there's this more, the sense of kinship with other forms of consciousness. So again, there's nothing here non-naturalistic, but if someone says, I've realized I identify now with other people's consciousness as well. I value them more, at least to more empathy. And perhaps even I feel a sense of not being scared of my own death, because if I identify with any conscious system, then a child will be born after I die, and I value that they exist as much as I value that I exist, because I've got out of my sense of self. And if you take that down to just identifying with being, I think you can have a convincing feeling of eternalism, of saying, well, I, as the fact of existence, will be there whenever anything exists. So after my death, I understood in this very zoomed out, version of selfhood where it includes everything, will continue to exist. Are you sympathetic to the idea that the sense of self can be that flexible in a way that could actually be useful to people? My instinct is when people overcome their fear of death in these studies, sometimes these are the kinds of experiences they're having. They're not thinking, I'll be a soul that will go to heaven, but they're having these naturalistic insights.
Yeah, that's my feeling. And in terms of the epistemic status, in terms of whether because of course, one thing that is important to point out is, if you've got a putative insight that people have under psychedelics and you're trying to scrutinize it, one gatekeeping question that you and I are going to ask is, well, is it compatible with naturalism? Because for us, if it's not, then it's probably wrong. But then even if it is, you've still got to ask, well, is it also true? Is it also plausible within a naturalistic frame? And so I think, these kinds of insights definitely are compatible with naturalism. Which parts of them are true and which parts are not, I'm still thinking about this, but it is really interesting, the idea, because what it comes down to is the question, is there anything sort of correct about identifying with this organism? Taking the idea of I, generating this idea of I or me, and binding it to this particular shape here. You said it's too early in the morning for you. For me, it's the end of a long day of work, and I don't know if I've got the synaptic efficacy to really go deeply into this at the moment. But perhaps the short thing to say is I agree, as a psychological matter, that this is what's going on a lot of the time with people overcoming fear of death. It isn't about new metaphysical beliefs that there's a universal consciousness or I'm going to have an afterlife. Sometimes it's about that kind of thing, but sometimes it's more about coming to feel more profoundly interconnected with others and with the natural world on the basis of recognizing commonalities, the things we have in common and the things that bind us, and that those sorts of things, on the face of it, there's no reason to think they couldn't be true. They look perfectly compatible with naturalism and perfectly plausible and perfectly in line with the sort of naturalized Buddhism, which is something I'm very sympathetic to.
Right. And you were saying how we will ask this question of, is it compatible with naturalism? It might be worth pausing and discussing kind of why we feel this way, because to some people there'll be a fear that we're just dogmatically, coming from mainstream academia, we just are kind of unthinkingly attached to this perspective. But for me, I feel it's an earnest, kind of honest conclusion that this perspective seems to be the most elegant, seems to fit the data best, and I get the same impression from you. And so when people have this kind of tension between, say, a cosmic consciousness experience and the mainstream world, the kind of naturalistic worldview, you write about the kind of different responses people can have, and one is to change their metaphysics, right, and to think that this is true. And I see this in, you have philosophers like Philip Goff arguing for panpsychism from a very naturalistic standpoint, saying there's nothing here. It really doesn't change anything about our kind of understanding of what's possible. It doesn't make telepathy possible or anything like that. But then you also have outside of academia philosophers like Bernardo Kastrup, who's extremely popular in psychedelic circles, who argues for what seems to me a very similar picture of kind of, they both seem to be saying consciousness is what reality is, and kind of there's what we call matter is another perspective. So you have these two perspectives. There's kind of consciousness is what reality is, and then when you look at it, it looks a certain way, and that's what we call matter. And I also think that Kastrup sees his picture as a very naturalistic worldview, even though it permits a bunch of kind of things that we think of as supernatural, telepathy, levitation, all that kind of stuff. And I guess I'm interested in your take as to why you reject those stances as naturalistic. To me, it has to do with if you damage a brain, if you damage a physical organism, or you alter it, say with psychedelic, it seems as a direction of causation from that to changing the mind. That to me is one of the most compelling reasons to think that mind is emergent. But I'd like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, very similar. And it's also my reason for rejecting certain naturalistic views, like in the whole embodied extended cognition sort of research program, you have people arguing that phenomenal consciousness, constitutively involves systems outside the brain, like the rest of the body outside the brain. And I think Antti Revonsuo, who's a Finnish neuroscientist and philosopher, lays the case out really clearly for thinking not just that consciousness is emergent, but that it is specifically a function of the brain. And it's basically, when you don't get the brain activity, you don't get the experience. And when you get the brain activity, you get the experience. It seems to be necessary and sufficient. And so he points out all these really obvious things. I mean, the effects of drugs on experience are one of them, of course. But Revonsuo points out that, if you have a deafferented limb, if you sever the connections by which, signals travel from the limb to the brain, then no matter what you do to the limb, because the signal is not getting to the brain, don't experience it. So, if consciousness somehow were a product of more than just the brain, I mean, obviously we're accepting that the brain needs the rest of the organism to be alive and to be functioning and to do its thing. But, why would that be the case? Why would kind of stopping the relevant impulses getting to the brain stop the experience if consciousness weren't something happening entirely within the brain? And then on the other hand, you can have things like phantom limbs, dreams, psychedelic experiences, all these cases, lucid dreams in particular is Revonsuo's favorite case study, where you can get all the phenomenal experience without any of the stuff happening outside of the brain. So did I do that the right way? Yeah, if you don't have if you've got the thing happening outside the brain, but you don't get the brain activity, you don't get the experience. So brain activity is necessary for consciousness. And then if you've got the right activity happening in the brain, if you stimulate it or have a dream or take a drug or whatever, even if the relevant external events are not happening, then you do get the experience. So it's this kind of double dissociation between experience and real external events, and the fact that it seems to be brain activity that is necessary and sufficient. That's what really drives me to not just a naturalistic view, but to the specific internalist type of naturalist view that Seth and others and Metzinger and people are defending and talking about. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It might be worth just as a kind of sidebar, my take. You were saying like about the necessity of the brain, but then we accept that the body is necessary in some minimal sense for kind of keeping the life process going, and supporting the brain. To me, I guess that is significant, because I came from a perspective of neuroscience, of thinking everything is just about the brain. You can kind of forget the body, and this kind of mainstream computationalist view of the brain as this information processing device. And then you get into interesting conversations about, well, is consciousness computation? Can machines become conscious? And I spent many years struggling with all these questions everyone struggles with around that. And then when I appreciated that evolutionarily the brains are always secondary to embodied living organisms, to me that was a profound perspective shift that allowed me to make a lot more sense of kind of put the brain in its place. So I think it's useful to have a synthesis of these two, where you accept that in organisms like us, the biological process that supports living, that is associated with consciousness, has really been concentrated in the brain, but it still exists in this embodied loop. So yeah, I wanted to say so that I think embodiment is a useful perspective to bring to this as well.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So do you believe in phenomenal consciousness in single-celled organisms?
I do, yeah. So I take a kind of biopsychist viewpoint that my instinct is that consciousness is almost a geometric phenomenon, so that it's when systems attempt separation with the rest of the world, you get, and if assert a boundary, that brings into existence the kind of belief space we've been talking about, predictive processing. And I think that is kind of what consciousness is: the ability to hold that the world around you is a certain way. And yeah, I being a neuroscientist, it took me a long time to really convince myself that this is more plausible, but I am convinced of it now. And I think that's also why consciousness feels fundamental in these experiences, because we realize it's not some, when we talk about consciousness being emergent, the mainstream view is, it comes along quite late in evolution. And we also have people I think also have this instinct that emergent phenomena aren't quite as real as fundamental phenomena. But I think just because something emerges, it still exists at the level that it exists, right? Life emerged, but I really exist. And so I think that's another reason when people think consciousness is fundamental, they're going from thinking it's some ephemeral, inconsequential epiphenomenal thing, to realizing, wow, it really exists. And then mistaking that for saying like it's fundamental.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And then so with we're talking about different solutions to this tension between a kind of cosmic consciousness experience and naturalism. And so if we just go through the other objections, solutions, some people would say change their metaphysics. Others say that metaphysical beliefs are kind of overvalued. Is this the position of Owen Flanagan you write about?
Yeah, it's really that, well-being is more important than knowledge, I guess, or at least in certain cases, cases like, the use of psychedelics and the use of related practices, meditation, yoga, for well-being, for spirituality, for flourishing. The position that Owen Flanagan and George Graham take is not that. I mean, it's part of a broader project, right? Because they're also trying to put pressure on the idea of a link between epistemic accuracy and mental health. And they're saying, look, we think that they talk about the psychedelic mystical experience as a metaphysical hallucination, but they say just because it's a hallucination doesn't mean it's unhealthy or should be pathologized. And they want to say that, engagement in these experiences doesn't necessarily imply pathology, but also can legitimately be pursued as part of the overall high stakes human project of living a good, happy, flourishing, meaningful life. So one part of the project is to say, there's no implication in either direction from epistemic accuracy to mental health. You can be perfectly mentally healthy and have a lot of false beliefs, or you can be mentally unhealthy with a lot of true beliefs. But then the associated point is that, look, epistemic accuracy isn't the be all and end all of life, of our existence, of our attempt to live a meaningful life. So what I guess I read into their position is that, having knowledge and having true beliefs sure might matter somewhat, but at least in these kinds of cases, they seem to think it's quite a bit less important than the sorts of existential, emotional, practical, perhaps even moral benefits that you can get. So yeah, that's one line. So yeah, one line you can take is to say the psychedelics tend to give you a true metaphysics, and another line is to say, well, maybe they tend to give you a false metaphysics, but it doesn't really matter. What's a lot more important than that is that they give you happiness and well-being and flourishing and these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because people like you and I are really interested in kind of metaphysical truth and not being deluded when it comes to these things. But I do think it's when I look at wider society, there's a lot of people really enjoy their magical thinking, I think, and that's not something I don't think we can see a future where that's entirely gone. And I don't think in most cases it's harmful when people engage in kind of supernatural thinking. And so I guess I'm interested in more like looking to the future in like the kind of culture we would like to see emerge around psychedelics, because I would really like to see conversations like this being valued, and naturalism being valued, because I think it kind of has everything out in the open, and we can approach everything philosophically and scientifically, and there's no kind of you lose the danger of stuff being in the shadows of just, because I say so, here's some dogma, that comes with certain supernatural beliefs. But at the same time, the last thing I would want to do is engage in a kind of neo-colonial project of saying all indigenous, communities that these psychedelics come from, with their own metaphysical frameworks, of wanting to argue in any way against them. And so I feel like perhaps the solution is this, that we know the place of metaphysics. We make it clear when we're having a conversation that's about ground truth, and that's when we bring to bear these tools and this perspective of naturalism. But then if people gain value from certain kind of beliefs, I think maybe for people like us who might have an instinct towards wanting to police whether people engage in delusional metaphysical beliefs or not, maybe being okay with that and allowing a diversity of different beliefs is the way forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much that I can argue with in that. I certainly don't want to go around policing what people believe, but I just, happen to have this sense, this intuition, which is the word philosophers use when they mean, this is just what I reckon. But I just tend to have this very strong sense that truth is important. Knowing what reality is really like is one of the central kind of valuable features of human life, or valuable capacities we have. And I think it's more that I think there is something of a responsibility on individuals, right, to try and make sure that the beliefs they form are true, or as kind of plausible and well grounded as possible, given the evidence and information available to them. And of course, I think that means the beliefs being naturalistic, because that's what I've concluded after my reflection is that, the most well grounded. But yeah, I mean, my views on all these questions have been developing over time as I've had lots of conversations like this one with lots of people and received feedback on my work and so on. And, I guess these days, yeah, what I'm more interested in than a plea for kind of naturalism in the psychedelic space is a sort of plea for epistemic and metaphysical sort of critical rationality and awareness and some kind of skepticism. The idea that, each person who has these kinds of experiences, or who thinks about these kinds of experiences, talks about them, forms some view on them, tries, and obviously not everyone has the luxury of devoting huge amounts of time to thinking about this, but I think in general people should just try and form beliefs on all kinds of topics, including the metaphysical status of psychedelic experience, that are as plausible and well grounded and close to the truth as possible. And that allows for the fact that we're still going to have disagreements about what the best grounded beliefs are, because, as you say, you know, we can't sort of directly access metaphysical truth. It's an intrinsically, you know, somewhat speculative area.
Right. And so would you say, is your stance that there are some kind of metaphysical risks or risks around metaphysical beliefs with psychedelics, but that the risks are small?
I don't know if I would say they're small. I think if you look at, I think they're there. I think how big they are varies depending on context and how they're used and so on. I guess what I try and argue for in the book is that they're smaller than they might initially appear to a skeptical naturalist. You know, you sort of take a zoomed out, coarse-grained look at the therapeutic use of psychedelics from a naturalistic perspective, and you have these basic findings that look, you know, we've got promising results in anxiety, in addiction, in various depression, various conditions, but the best studied indication is existential distress, depression and anxiety in terminal illness. This is where we've got a couple of reasonably sized studies that have been published where people seem to have one or two or three of these experiences under supervision. They rated among the top 5 most personally meaningful or spiritually significant events of their life. Their mood and symptoms and so on improve greatly, and they seem to lose their fear of death. And what predicts all of this is, you know, a mystical type experience of unity, oneness, noetic quality, and so on. It's very easy to get this picture that the central causal mechanism is changing metaphysical beliefs, right? That you go in for psychedelic therapy, you get given the kind of calibrated dose that's been determined by prior research. And if you're lucky, you know, you have a complete mystical experience, you develop an unshakable belief in cosmic consciousness or another reality or a great beyond. And that is what leads to you having a reduced fear of death and reduced anxiety and depression and things like this. So it's kind of like non-naturalistic metaphysical beliefs may not be an inevitable result of psychedelic administration, but they're a necessary part of this treatment model. And so I'm trying to say, no, that's not really how it works. That you only get that kind of effect in a subset of cases, and that's not what's doing the heavy lifting therapeutically. It might, in some cases, come along for the ride and give you an extra bit of oomph, but it's not the main mechanism, and you can still have the kind of transformative experience and still have the bulk of the therapeutic benefits without any of those belief changes. And I think in many cases people do.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. To me, it feels like almost groundedness is the one of the therapeutic mechanisms where if you're lost in conceptualizing, you don't realize you're conceptualizing. If you can go from that to just existing, there's a sense of release and feeling, yeah, like you are grounded in existence that I think is therapeutically beneficial, which does not rely on any belief formation. And I mean, you write about, there's this interesting word, alif. You write about kind of metaphysical alif theory. Could you quickly explain what that is?
Yeah. So A-leaf, I think, is how it's usually pronounced. So
Okay.
to contrast with B-leaf, A-leaf, B-leaf. And yeah, so A-leaf is a term of art in philosophy, and it basically refers to a mental representation you have of the world, some idea you have about the world that you don't really believe. You know, if you're asked if it's true or not, you'll say, no, it's not true. But clearly on some level, you think it's true because it still influences your emotions and your behavior and so on. So the classic example is someone is walking out onto a transparent balcony and they know it's perfectly safe. They know that all the materials are very durable and robust and they're not going to fall through and plummet to their death, but they're still shaking and sweating and sort of inching their way out. So even though if you ask them, you know, is the balcony safe? They're going to say, yes, I believe it's safe. Clearly they have a mental representation of the balcony as unsafe, and you can see that it's influencing their behavior and their emotions and so on. And so this is something that, yeah, needs to be considered in relation to psychedelics. And this is something that Flanagan and Graham do consider in that paper we were talking about, the idea that even if people aren't kind of having their metaphysical beliefs consistently change, and that's what's underlying the therapeutic effects. Maybe it's changes in metaphysical beliefs instead, right? So maybe everyone who has the mystical type experience as it's defined psychometrically has some sort of mystical vision, has some sort of metaphysical vision of a cosmic consciousness or another reality or something like that. And then afterwards, well, some of them believe it, some of them don't in terms of their considered views, but it doesn't really matter because it's not believing that it's true that does the work. It's actually having the experience and then having the memory of the experience. And, you know, if you read things that Benny Shannon says about this, it's pretty easy to think that, you know, after all his ayahuasca experiences, he might not believe that, you know, there is a cosmic consciousness or a universal mind, but it seems plausible that he believes it to some extent. And he talks about this idea of actually adopting this kind of perennial philosophy, metaphysic in a sort of poetic or pragmatic spirit, some kind of non-literal spirit. And so, yeah, that's something that needs to be considered as a hypothesis about the therapeutic mechanism. And I still think it's not plausible, but it remains as a possibility, you know, even if you've concluded that changes in metaphysical beliefs is not what's doing the main therapeutic work. It could still be the induction of these metaphysical beliefs in a cosmic consciousness or another reality or something like that.
Right. And so you think this could be a kind of, you know, a hardline secular atheist can approach psychedelic therapy without any fears?
Oh, I don't think anyone should approach psychedelic therapy without any fears. But I think people who are worried that, you know, they're going to have a hallucinatory experience, which is just going to make them uncritically accept, you know, what they see as false or implausible metaphysical beliefs, can rest relatively easy and basically realize that, you know, that sort of experience, you know, the non-naturalistic metaphysical type experience is not something you always get. And even when you do get it, there's ample evidence that people, maybe not always, but very often retain an ability to reflect critically on it afterwards. So I think it's, you know, the noetic quality might be one of the things that looks worrying if you're a naturalist or an atheist or someone looking at this. You might think, well, I'm not going to be able to take a critical stance on it otherwise because it has this overwhelming cognitive authority. You just can't help but believe it. And I think maybe in some cases that's true, but I think that's, in terms of the therapeutic use of psychedelics, that's probably a fairly small proportion of cases. There are people who don't really have any sort of non-naturalistic metaphysical vision at all, and then there are people who do, but still seem able to reflect critically on it afterwards and try and figure out which parts of it, if any, they actually believe and endorse. And yeah, it's not necessary for the therapeutic benefits.
Right. And to address the elephant in the room for anyone watching on video, do you have a naturalistic explanation for the phenomenon of beard growth in men following an interest in psychedelics?
Oh,
it seems to be a thing.
It does indeed. No, I'm afraid that one's still a mystery. Further research required.
Exactly. That's the next project. All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris. It's been really fun.
My pleasure. Thanks, James.
And the book is Philosophy of Psychedelics, which is out now, and I highly recommend it. Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.